Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 8th chapter of the first epistle to the Corinthians. And the church at Corinth is what I like to call, and I don't think I'm being too harsh on them in so saying, a problem church. They had problems top to bottom, all around, all over the place, and we learn much of what these problems are in the context of which Paul proposes his solution. So in the first chapter, we learn that there's divisions and quarrels and factionalism between them. Then in the 5th chapter, we read that there's a sexual sin. I think a man was having sex with his stepmother, and the evidence suggests that he did repent and he was restored. But also the practice of judging in courts, in secular courts, was evidently problematic amongst this assembly. They were taking each other to court, and that bore a terrible public witness for the unity that we have in Messiah. We should settle all our differences between ourselves without going to the courts or anyone or anything else. Then the 7th chapter, the one which comes before this, he expresses his thoughts on marriage. And this was the problems were perhaps inevitable in hindsight of the newly included Gentiles with the Jews. So how is marriage to work in such a covenant community? And this covenant community, unlike Israel, is not defined by blood but belief. So he says that for practical reasons, he doesn't want a lot of them remained married to Gentile husbands and wives, but they became converted in their marriage. So the new crop, the new unwedded and unyoung people, he prefers that they stay as he was a bachelor and unmarried. Paul was married to the church. That was his only real commitment. And but he also says that they should not marry Gentiles, those who remain unbelief. He's talking about belief, not background, because the new covenant community is defined by belief, not blood. So as long as it's anyone of a different race that's part of the one of the values or the privileges of living under Christian liberty, we are no longer bound by the law, at least not in its entirety, and we are free to do certain things such as marry believers of any race we happen to fall in love with, but we got to make sure that they're Christian, because it's not going to work out for the kids in that. And he also says the youth, better to marry than burn in lust. Paul had very Spartan personal standards, so he didn't burn in lust, but he also didn't accept money. That forms the juxt of the chapter which comes after this, which we're going to do pretty soon. And but he was realistic enough not to impose his own Spartan standards on the church at law. So yes, ministers could marry. They had to be the husband of one wife and blameless, and all the others that we read of in Timothy and Titus. But so the nature of the controversy which is addressed was addressed earlier and elsewhere in the 15th chapter of Acts, the 20th and 29th chapter, the practice of sacrifice or eating the meat which was sacrificed to idols. In the verdict, they said that was one of the 4 things they refused to accept Gentile practices of. So by this time, some 10, 15 years had passed in between those dates, and the Gentiles were the ones who were kind of stumbling over the meat offered to their idols. But Paul addresses how the spiritually weak and the spiritually mature are to coexist in harmony, and that is one of the incidental messages which comes over this more negative controversy. So the opening verse reads, "And concerning offerings to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up." So he's actually quoting a familiar statement that would have been current on the grapevine. We all have knowledge. That was one spiritually superior, self-exalted superior brother or believer's way of dismissing the claims to knowledge that others did. They just said, oh, we all have knowledge, but my knowledge is greater than yours is the implicit entailment of that statement. But knowledge is all well and good, but apart from love, it is useless. In itself, it puffs up, whereas if we are motivated by a love for the truth and the truth of love, we will share knowledge in loving manner, and we will not come across as know-it-alls or talking down to anyone, but genuinely concerned for their intellectual improvement and welfare. And love in itself builds up, so all the knowledge in the world is no substitute for love. If anyone thinks that he knows somewhat, he does not yet know as he should know. So this is at least as old as Socratic philosophy. He claimed to be the wisest man in Greece because he knew that he knew nothing, and he was attributed such by the oracles of Delphi, who are a respected religious authority in ancient Athens, and they claimed that he was the wisest man in all of Greece. And so he went out to inspect. He interviewed the respective classes, the artisans and the poets, and they all had knowledge respective to their crafts, but for all they knew, they really knew that they knew nothing. So the paradoxical principle is Socratic ignorance, that the road and path to wisdom cannot come without the acknowledgement that that the one thing we do know is that we know nothing. We have to come with a state of nothingness and emptiness in order to be filled by the knowledge, much in the same way we cannot come to salvation unless we come to an awareness and acknowledgement of our own sin. The only thing we contribute to our salvation is the sin which we are saved from. So there's always more that anyone who claims to know this book cover to cover. I've read it cover to cover, but I don't know it cover to cover. No one does. No human does. So you got to eliminate that arrogation of knowledge, because there's always something you're missing, or always something you could learn more that you're overlooking within these covers. So it's a safer foundation to approach wisdom from ignorance, much in the same way that it is appropriate to approach exaltation in the spirit of humility. But if anyone loves Elohim, this one is known by him. So the greatest pleasure and treasure and prize in the universe can be loving, to be beloved by the one who is love, and he loves us all in some sense, but to love us especially and beyond death is the greatest. That is to what we know pales in comparison to what he knows, and he knows who he loves. So that is of greater value, to know that we are loved by Elohim. If we ever, no matter how many more ideas we accumulate, no matter how advanced and deep we get, if we lose sight of the fact that we are known and loved by Elohim, then it's all for naught. It's all in vain, our endless accumulative pursuit of greater knowledge. So then, concerning the eating of offerings to idol, we know that an idol is not in the world, and that there is no other Elohim but this one. So he's affirming the lack of reality, and compared to the complete and total and only an exclusive reality amongst the deities. All the others outside of Elohim are made in the image of man. They are self-created inventions, whereas Israel alone and then the Christian community had the revelation of the one who created them, while these other cultures and civilizations were inventing their own gods, but more specifically relevant to its own chronological context. This is addressed in eating idols, so we get a prelude of what he's going to say next here. I'm just going to read it. For even if there are so-called mighty ones, whether in the heavens or on the earth, as there are many mighty ones and many masters, for us there is one Elohim, the Father from whom all came and in whom we are, and one Master, Yahshua, Messiah, through whom all came, and we through him. So there's a lot to digest here. The reason I wanted to combine those verses is they collectively comprise a full sentence. So he's saying that even if there's some semblance of reality or existence to these gods and idols, and the heavens or the earth, and however many gods there could be in other peoples, we know, we affirm, and we uphold that there is only one Elohim, the Father from whom all came. He is our Creator, He is our Father, and His Son is also whom all came, and we through Him. All things were created for Him, by Him, and for His pleasure, we read in John 1 and somewhere in 1 Colossians. However, not all have this knowledge, but some, being aware of the idol, until now it having been offered to an idol, so their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Now he's identifying it as a species of spiritual weakness and immaturity, and a weakness of conscience to allow an idol, something like that, who we ascribe no significance to, no greater significance outside of the wood or gold or silver that it is represented as, that is a state of spiritual stupidity, objectively speaking, with the knowledge that these idols have no meaning. And there were two typical places in the ancient world where meats were sold. One was at the market, where the prices were always higher, but the discount and the cheaper ones were the ones that were left over from these sacrifices to idols. But food does not commend us to Elohim, for we are none the better if we eat, nor any worse for not eating. Now what he's saying basically here is the dietary observances and standards of the believer do not make or break the quality of the Christian. That we are not defined, the kingdom is not of eating and drinking, but in righteousness, in truth and righteousness, we read somewhere in the book of Romans. So we're not changed. We're ascribing far too much significance if we think that it defines our character, what we eat, and that's just to miss the larger picture of religiosity and spirituality altogether. And so Paul has this knowledge. Apparently some weaker believers do not, and that is to whom he is addressing. But he's also addressing the spiritually stronger believers, not to upset them or offend them or provoke them, even inadvertently, because the last thing we want to do is to have these weak brothers stumble in the faith and then just walk away and not stick with it. But look to it, lest someone this right of yours becomes a stumbling block to those who are weak. So his main concern is that the spiritually strong believers might flaunt their Christian liberty in the faces of those who are spiritually weak. We often think of spiritually strong people as those who follow the list and obey all the rules, but that is no substitute for faith and freedom, and the freedom that faith provides, and the faith that can only be found in freedom. But for if anyone sees you, you have knowledge eating in an idol's place. Shall not his conscience, if he is weak, be built up to eat offerings to idols? So he's also worried about a lower level of spiritually intelligent believer who's going to attribute a Christian who's strong in the faith, who has no qualms of conscience about eating this food offered to idols. But the spiritually weak person is going to have their conscience seared by just the thought that they are endorsing the practice of idolatry in general and the idol to whom they were offered. Idolatry was one of the big no-nos in the Jerusalem Council I earlier referenced in Acts, the 15th chapter. There were four things that anything outside of the four, the Gentiles essentially had unlimited liberty to continue to live as they were accustomed to living. But there were four things, two of which are idols and meat offered to idols. And there's two others. I honestly didn't look it up. But moving on, 11th verse. So this weak brother, for whom Messiah died, shall perish through your knowledge. So this is a threat that a lot of intelligent people can't foresee, that their knowledge will have a contaminating and destructive effect on one who is not equal to or greater than in knowledge. Because they are weak, it will create all sorts of confusion that one who is not advanced or mature in theological, connecting theological inferences. So the great danger and threat to which he warns is that they are going to perish, and that eternally, through your knowledge. So the last thing you want to do is be a stumbling block unto others. If you are strong in your faith, that's good for you, but you still exist in a community where a lot of spiritually weaker brothers and individuals do not, they will stumble over what you, who are strong in the faith, can walk through with no regard. But we just want to be mindful if such a parallel situation or occasion occurs, to be mindful of those who may think differently than us. Now, sinning in this way against the brothers and wounding their weak conscience, you sin against the Messiah. So the Messiah is the great Democrat. He elevates the treatment we show to the least among his followers as accurate reflection of how we treat them. So when we sin, we not only sin against the person we sin against, but also the God whom we offend and his Son who paid he paid our sin penalty price. So we are essentially and effectively nailing nails into the cross when we sin, because it was for our sin, all time, past, present, and future, that he died. So we have a part in what went into that death, and we always have to be mindful of that and appreciate the amazing distance that he traveled to be our propitiation and our atonement and resurrection and salvation. Final verse, verse 13. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I am never again going to eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. So Paul, an extremist always, he did resort to extreme measures, often characteristically. He is not going to let the sight of meat touching his lips be available or visible to anyone else, because he is so Spartan about this responsibility that he has of the spiritually strongest one. He is lecturing and instructing those who are spiritually stronger than ordinary, but not quite as spiritually stronger as one. He was not a stumbling block to them. He's letting them know he won't be there to correct their example, but he's telling them not to be a stumbling block, because what you do is you draw others away. So even though you may remain secure in your salvation, the last thing we want to do is earn that at someone else's expense. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.